Hi, this is an introduction to social and political philosophy. My name is Mark Thorsby, and in this video, we're going to be talking about the principles of justice. In particular, we'll be looking at some of the basic concepts within the philosophy of John Rawls. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. Let me start off today with just some real brief comments about John Rawls' biography and life. And again, these are extremely brief and rudimentary, so there's lots more to be learned in your own research. The first thing to note is that John Rawls is a modern philosopher, and in many ways he carries on the social contract tradition that we saw initiated with philosopher Thomas Hobbes. But he's a contemporary and a modern philosopher, in the sense that he was born in 1921 and he died just a couple of years ago in 2002. In 1950, he worked and received his PhD from Princeton University, where he taught for a couple of years. And then in 1955, he became a Fulbright Fellow to Christ Church. For those of you that may not be familiar with Christ Church, it is the most prestigious college in Oxford University. Oxford is made up of a whole series of different colleges, and Christ Church is I think for the most part, the most well-known and the most prestigious of all. So that is quite an accomplishment in itself. After returning to the U.S., he eventually got a associate professorship and eventually a full professorship at Cornell University and MIT. He eventually moved to Harvard, where he's a professor there for nearly 30 years. Though he wrote enormously, and there's lots and lots of work by Rawls, his most important work came in 1971 with the Theory of Justice. I'll show you what it looks like. I've got the original printing right here, paperback printing, from 1971. This is his seminal work, his magnum opus, if you will. And this text very much has become sort of a mainstay within the canon of political and social philosophy. Because one of the things we see is that Rawls provides an update, if you will, to social contract theory that's really badly needed after the social philosophies of the 19th and 20th centuries. So that's a little bit about who John Rawls is. We're going to get into a lot of that stuff today and talk in a lot more in depth. But before I do so, I think that it's probably helpful to begin with a sort of brief review regarding why it is we're looking at John Rawls in particular. And I think the sort of core question that's at stake here is whether or not political liberalism is bankrupt. And that's one of my overriding concerns in this course that I'm hoping to sort of draw out from this material. Now, just as a reminder, there's lots of different definitions for what liberalism means or refers to. In its bare bones sense, though, liberalism, coming from the root word liberty, refers to the idea of a promotion and protection of individual liberty. So socially, what that meant is that social contract theory became the principal means of discussion, or this principal political mechanism for promoting individual liberty. Now, it's key here to remember that for the liberal, the promotion of individual liberty and its protection is always maintained with a certain sort of balance for the overriding concerns of the majority or the general will, as Rousseau called it. So, but I think whenever we talk about social contract theory, we should understand that social contract theory is itself a sort of liberal solution to the problem of politics. But here's the question that sort of gets raised, I think, for us today, which is, can political liberalism result in the promotion of freedom given the fragmentation of social power and the demands of a modern market economy? Now, to put it simply, what I think is at stake here is whether or not we think the social contractual institutions that we've created are up to the task, really, of promoting and maintaining liberty throughout. What's at stake here is whether or not liberalism is a project that can succeed, or has it succeeded, or can it succeed. That's, in a sort of general sense, some of the things we're talking about. Now, what I want to do now is sort of work backwards in the course of the lectures we've looked at here, and sort of point to some of, I think, the key problems that are being generated, or that we've seen generated by looking at other philosophers. For instance, when we looked at Foucault one of the things we discovered is that power is distributed through social institutions. And in that lecture, we made a distinction here between social institutions and political institutions. Social contract theory is fundamentally oriented towards the creation of political institutions. But there are other institutions, for instance, prisons, universities, and so on and so forth, that play a really vital role in the development in the maintenance of a civic society, but that power is disseminated through these institutions as well. So this creates the problem where we recognize that power doesn't exist solely within the political institutions of a social contract theory, which raises a number of questions for us about how it is we can maintain liberalism or defend liberalism given this situation. The other thing we discovered with Foucault is that power relations operate on the body, and I think a helpful distinction gets made in Foucault's discussion of governmentality, where he distinguishes between power and sovereignty. Sovereignty refers to the ability of the government, essentially, to make laws, either prohibitions or positive sorts of laws. But but making laws is not in itself what power is. Power is a wider field. It's a larger genus for the species of sovereignty. So when we understand that, what we recognize here is that social contract theory, sheerly limited to political institutions, doesn't fully protect liberty, especially when we talk about the power relations that operate against the body. Anyway, and jumping back even further back here to Foucault, we saw the articulation of a historical dialectic, in which case, Hegel sees society as slowly in a process of evolution, and that this evolution is resulting in our political institutions. But our political institutions aren't formed whole cloth the way the social contract theorists seem to suggest. The other thing that we discover with Hegel is that this historical process is shaping the consciousness of individuals. And it means that political organization is secondary to a greater social dialectic. What's at stake here when we talk about the historical dialectic is the idea that social institutions appear to be the result or the consequence rather than the cause of liberty or the development of liberty. So the social contract may be an inadequate explanation. Now, of course, we mentioned Hegel, we have to talk about Marx. With Marx, we see an increasing chipping away at this notion of social contract theory, or the efficacy of it, by the idea that economics is more fundamental than politics. And of course, Marx's entire project here is one of articulating these economic conditions. So that means politics sits, as you will, as a sort of icing on the cake. But the cake is economics. And so social contract theory, which addresses the icing, if you will, is fundamentally incapable of actually creating positive changes in equality without also changing the economic conditions. So that means that capitalism materially benefits society, but capitalism requires the alienation of labor, as we discussed. So that means that capitalism ultimately requires the material and social inequity of others. So that sense, now whether or not you agree with Marx or not is besides the point, because what's at stake here isn't whether or not Marx's theory was correct, but we can see Marx as a challenge to social contract theory. And our task today with Rawls is to see if we can defend that. So what's the basic problem with the social contract tradition emanating from Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau? Well, the problem seems to be that the establishment of a political institution via social contract is inadequate to promote liberty of individuals while also promoting equality. Now, there's one other piece of the puzzle here that we haven't really gone through in this course, unfortunately, but I think that we have to mention, and that's the discussion of utilitarianism. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with utilitarianism, the utilitarianism is the basic idea that we should promote, we should promote the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. This is what John Stuart Mill referred to as the greatest happiness principle. And the basic idea here, it's a moral theory, but it certainly applies to politics. The moral theory is that is known as a type of consequentialism. When a consequentialism refers to any ethics or moral theory where the consequences of an action determine the moral status of the said action. So, for instance, if we ask the question, is it morally right to go to war? Because war may result in the killing of innocent people. Well, the utilitarian is going to say, well, it depends on what the consequence of the war is. If the consequence of killing innocent people is a result that actually promotes more happiness for more people overall, then that means going to war is morally correct. Now, there's a lot more to talk about in terms of utilitarians. It's very sophisticated there, at least there's sophisticated versions of it. We could talk about Jeremy Bentham, who is a hedonist utilitarian, or John Stuart Mill, who's a little bit more nuanced, I think. But it still raises the question, but utilitarianism ultimately sees our actions as utilities, as tools, as ways for making the world better. But there's a problem, right? And the problem is that justice, right? The problem is what happens if we can promote more happiness by ignoring justice, by ignoring what's ultimately fair. And that certainly does happen. In John Stuart Mill here, John Rawls here, he's ultimately concerned with utilitarianism because it seems like social contract theory since Rousseau has essentially just moved into what we might call as a utilitarian ethos, where specific legislation, whether or not a certain law should be created, is essentially determined by whether or not that law will promote the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. And the worry here is whether or not justice is under sufficient protection. Or here's another question too: is the inequality created by capitalism, going back to Marx here, justified consequentially? Or in other words, is an exception to justice for the sake of material economy justification for social inequity, right? Because really the problem that I think we're trying to address here is whether or not our political institutions are sufficient to resolve some of these outstanding questions of social inequity. And of course, capitalism or our economy is the perfect place to talk about that case. Because, for instance, people are born every day who are just born into poverty. They have no choice but to be born in the situation they are. And because of the economics of capitalism, it tends to be the case that once one is once one is in poverty, one will typically remain at poverty. So that raises a fundamental question about whether or not we have a just society, especially when you combine this Marxist idea that, well, economics is fundamentally shaping our political institutions. If that's the case, we end up with this sort of utilitarian vacuum, or we end up with the idea of we have social justice in name only, and I think that's obviously worrisome and problematic. We're going to see that John Rawls is in particular interested in overcoming what he sees as a sort of utilitarian ethos within discussions of political discourse. So how do we get out of this mess? Well, it seems like what we need a principle to establish justice. We need a principle that can help us understand what justice looks like and whether or not certain exceptions to justice or to the promotion of freedom and equality is permissible. Now, this principle that is we're going to try to see if we can find to establish justice needs to establish justice across multiple institutions. That's the first thing we really need, given the sort of arc of our course. But the second thing we need is we need this principle to help us address these various problems of social inequity, and in particular, economic inequality. Okay? So I think that's what we're after here. So where are we going to start? Well, we're going to start here with John Rawls, but what we need to start with is a question of, well, what does the initial state of social equity even look like? What would a just society even look like from the very beginning? Because once we can establish that measure, or at least that standard rather, then we'll be able to measure our own society up against that guiding post, if you will. So we've got to start there by sort of looking at what does the initial social state of equity look like, and then going backwards what are the principles of justice that are in operation within that initial social state. Now, this, of course, I'm describing is the project of John Rawls. John Rawls is going to precisely give us an answer to those questions in his theory of justice. Now, there's a lot of different things I'm going to take you through to talk about in terms of this theory of justice. And I hope I'm not going to go too quickly, but these are the fundamentals of the argument. You can see it's a very long and a very big book here. So obviously we're going to be going through it fairly quickly. And of course, the reading I've just given you excerpts to read from. So let's dive into it. The first thing I want to sort of mention, which I didn't include in the online reading I've posted, is the idea that John Rawls begins in the very beginning here by discussing what he calls a well-ordered society. And the goal here is that and when we talk about a well-ordered society, this is the fundamental goal. We're looking to create or establish or maintain a society that's well-ordered in terms of justice. That means that a well-ordered society would be a just society. Well, here's the definition that Rawls actually gives. A well-ordered society is, or rather, a society is well-ordered when it is not only designed to advance the good of its members, but also effectively regulated by a public conception of justice. So number one, what that means is that first, everyone is going to accept and knows that the others accept the same principles of justice. So his idea here is that a well-ordered society is one where everyone's going to accept whatever principles of justice we have, and we're all going to know that everyone else accepts those too, which means that there's a uniform standard of conduct, or at least there's a uniform regulatory means for determining what wrong and right, just or unjust conduct looks like. And number two, the basic social institutions, whatever they are, they have to generally satisfy, the basic social institutions generally satisfy and are generally known to satisfy these principles of justice. So what we're after here is a society that ultimately everyone knows and operates on these standards or principles of justice, but the idea also is that our social institutions do as well. And see, this is why I think how we can see Rawls here is something of a response to Foucault. Now, the thing we have to mention, and Rawls immediately admits this after he talks about the well-ordered society, is that our existing societies are, for the most part, not well-ordered. Now, there may be some well-ordered societies for sure, but for the most part, it doesn't look like they are. Now, why is this? Well, the first idea here is that there's lots and lots of disagreement about justice. Because remember, the first constraint here was that everyone has to accept and know that the others accept the same principles of justice. Well, in our society, there's a whole bunch of disagreement about what counts as justice. For instance, we could see, at least within the scope of the politics for the United States, we could see the Republicans and the Democrats as essentially operating, or at least we could see them in conflict in terms of their conceptions of justice, especially when we talk about something like the market economy, right? You need look no further than, for instance, the government regulations concerning economic productivity. For instance, look at for instance, the recent, a couple years ago, passing sorry, I've lost track here. Recently, there was a huge bill in Congress that helped to regulate the derivative markets, for instance. And this sort of economic regulation was basically rejected by the entire Republican Party and supported by the majority of the Democrat Party. So that raises a quick question. That means that fundamentally, Republicans, and of course I'm speaking in generalizations here, so you'll have to forgive the stereotype, but in general, it looks like Republicans think that there's something problematic or something unjust about trying to regulate natural economic activity. For instance, you could talk about the healthcare bill. Maybe that's an easier example, right? Many people think that it's fundamentally unjust for the government to require them to buy private market-driven healthcare insurance. where others think that that is fundamentally just. Now, right, you can see here there's a lot of disagreement. So that means what we need to do is we need to modify our conception of justice to some extent. And I think that Rawls does provide us a modified conception when he tells us, quote, institutions are just, then, when no arbitrary distinctions are made between persons in assigning of basic rights and duties, and when the rules determine a proper balance between completing claims to the advantages of social life. So the idea here is that even when people disagree about the particulars of justice, I think everyone is going to agree that institutions are just if rules that govern who can or can't do certain things, that is, when rules are created that govern the basic rights and duties of the people within the institutions or governed by the institutions, that those determinations or distinctions be made in a way that's not arbitrary. For instance, right, that people are not denied certain rights and duties within an institution because of their race or because of their class or because of their gender or even, we might say, their sexual preferences. Now, so this is the idea that even if we can't agree on specific elements of justice, that doesn't mean that we're left with nowhere to go. We can begin with this modified conception of justice in which we essentially want to say that, listen, the rules that govern should not be arbitrary. Now, what that means, arbitrary, and how we define arbitrary or the various social advantages here can be difficult to do, but I think it can be done. And in fact, we'll see that Rawls is going to do precisely that. Now, he's going to start with this idea of what he calls the original social agreement. And let's see here. The original social agreement refers to the idea that what we need to do to determine these principles, and really we're looking at principles of justice that look at the entire basic structure of the society. So this basic structure needs to be just, right? So it ought to be just. Now, if it's just, then that raises the question, well, what exactly is the guiding principle of justice here? And there's a conceptual constraint that comes up almost immediately. The sorts of principles we're talking about in terms of justice are principles that are going to apply to what Rawls calls free and rational persons. So you can see here that Rawls is dedicated, in fact he says so, to a certain conception of human existence, where A, it's possible for people to act freely, and B, that people can act rationally. Now you can see here that Rawls, what he's going to do with this original position is he's going to assume that within the original position, people are free and rational. Now, I don't think that fully is going to overcome what I referred to earlier as the Hegelian challenge in terms of consciousness. Because remember, Hegel's idea was that consciousness and reason is changing and evolving over time. So that means that an original position would be a position that's pre-political, but if it's pre-political, then that means that it would not be then that means that, well, let me put it this way. For Hegel, there is no such thing as pure reason. Reason is constantly changing and evolving. So I don't know if that fully is going to overcome the Hegelian challenge, but this conceptual constraint is not irrational, right? It makes a lot of sense, and besides, I think that all of us are going to be committed to the idea that if we're going to find out what principles of justice are, that they're going to be principles that are reasonable, and they're principles that could apply to free individuals. So I'm not sure, I don't want to talk too much about it, but I think this conceptual constraint is important, both in terms of the legitimacy of Rawls's position or his argument, and in terms of a possible critique against Rawls. But anyway, so that means that whatever this principle is that we're going to talk about, this principle, or principles as we'll see, will be responsible for assigning the basic rights and duties of people within a society. So that's what we're looking at. And remember, the core concept here that we're talking about in terms of justice is the question, we can conceive of justice here as fairness. And that's sort of, if you will, our intuitive sense of justice, where if you ask someone what's just, they're going to generally say, well, justice is when we treat each other fairly. Now, of course, what is fair treatment? But this is the basic conception that Rawls is interested in defending, and he doesn't think it's wrong. But what he wants to do is he wants to prove in more specificity how this notion of justice as fairness could actually be applied politically or socially. Now, back to the original position a little bit here. The original position, Rawls says, is very similar to the state of nature that you see in Hobbes or Locke or Rousseau, right? So it's a little bit different here in that the state of nature, he's not arguing in the same sense. What he wants to argue from is that politics can begin from an original position. But you can see, I think he wants to stray away from the language of nature and the language of a state of nature because it's such a... you scared me. Okay, sorry about that. My son walked in and I didn't realize it and he scared me. You guys probably saw the whole thing on there, so it's kind of funny. But anyway, let me get back to what I was saying. So the original position is similar conceptually to the state of nature concept that we saw in Locke and Hobbes. The first thing here is it's not historical. So Rawls isn't saying that this actually happened. He's also not saying that this is what primitive societies would do before they created a society. This is purely a hypothetical situation. And it is a hypothetical situation because it's functioning as something of a mechanism for us to evaluate what the principles of justice are, right? So this is purely hypothetical, but it's hypothetical in the sense that it's going to meet certain logical criteria we have that will help us establish these principles of justice so that hopefully we can apply them to our real situation. Now, in this hypothetical situation, it's one in which no one has knowledge of their class status, their social position, material wealth. We don't know about the distributions of assets or resources. And we also don't know what people's personal attributes are. Now remember, just to recall, Hobbes talked about the idea that in the state of nature, everyone has essential equality. And we even remarked that for Hobbes, he even says that includes strength and intelligence. But we know in our society that people do not have equal strength and intelligence. So one of the things that I think Rawls is doing here is he's to some degree updating the conceptual theory that undergirds contractarianism. And he's using the original position here to essentially provide a position where everyone's essentially equal without stating that everyone is equal in essence, because he doesn't think that. So he wants to create a social equitable situation, but he does that instead of by saying that everyone's equal, he does it by stripping away our knowledge of all of these things. So this is what the original position is, and the idea here is that from the original position, how could we establish principles of justice? So you can imagine that if we were, go back here, if we were in the original position, imagine, for instance, you're with a group of people on a desert island or something, but before you determine how you're going to create your society, right, you want to create the most just society. So we're going to start off by creating rules or organizing the structure of our society in the most fair way possible. And the fairest way would seem to be to take away our natural dispositions and interests, right? Hobbes talks about the fact, Hobbes was an egoist, so he believed people naturally pursue their self-interest. But you can see here is that if we don't get rid of our self-interest, in terms of creating a society, we're ultimately going to probably create a society that fits ourselves, right? So for instance, I'm a philosopher, so if it was just up to me, I would probably create a society where the philosophers rule, like Plato. But that doesn't seem to be very fair, because you can see that I'm naturally, my preferences and my biases are naturally going to come out in terms of the policies or the types of society that I would want to create. So what we have to do is take away all of that knowledge. And then hopefully from there, as a group of people, and that means that we're all coming together on this desert island, I take away my knowledge of philosophy and all of my dispositions and biases, and we'll take those away from you, and we'll take those away from you, and so on and so forth, such that we're in this original position where all of us fundamentally don't know who we are in the society, what role we will take up in the society, or how wealth gets distributed and so forth. And so his idea is that given that original position, it's likely that we're going to sort of work out the best way to make an arrangement that's fair, because after all, after the original position's over, I'm going to have to live in that society, and I might end up being a poor person or a rich person. I don't know. So I may end up being an economist, a business person, or a philosopher. I don't know. And so maybe this original position can help us articulate what the principles of justice would be. Okay, now the use of these principles. So the principles of justice are also chosen behind a veil of ignorance. And I'm going to talk about that because this notion of a veil of ignorance is actually quite important for understanding Rawls. But let me read you this quote here that comes from page 13. By the way, the page numbers I'm giving you here come from the 1971 edition. So if you're using an older edition or an excerpt, your page numbers will look differently. But these are the original pagination numbers. Anyway, here's the quote. Quote, moreover, assuming that the original position does a set of principles, it will then be true that whenever social institutions satisfy these principles, those engaged in them can say to one another that they are cooperating on terms to which they would agree if they were free and equal persons whose relations with respect to one another were fair. So what's his idea here? What he wants to say is that we'll start with this original position, we'll articulate principles that'll help us figure out what would be the just forms or structure to create society. And then what we can do is once we have these principles, then when we look at various social institutions, we can ask this question. Does the particular social institution satisfy the principles of justice that were derived within the original position? If they do, then we can say the institution is a just institution, or at least it operates justly. If they don't, then of course we'll say the reverse. So this brings us to the question of method. Now, method and the problem of deliberation. So let me sort of zoom in here. What exactly is method? That is, there is, to put it sort of coyly, there's a method to Rawls's madness, and here's what it essentially looks like. We'll assume the original position, and in it so assuming that original position, using this veil of ignorance, we're going to assume that everyone is a rational but disinterested person. Now, what does this notion of disinterested mean? All that simply means is that I don't have a particular interest to fulfill within a setting of deliberation, right? So for instance, we're on our desert island, we're deliberating about what the rules of our society should be, that is, who should be a fisherman, who should be a hunter, etc., etc. But it's in so deciding, we have to be reasonable, but we have to be disinterested. I can't want to create the rules to help me out. So number 3 here is that then we're going to determine what principles could be established in the course of procedural deliberation, that is, figuring out what the procedure for deciding things would be. And then he gives us a very, very important idea here, and that's the notion of reflective equilibrium. And it's important here to recognize that when Rawls is writing this book, he doesn't know necessarily that his principles of justice are going to work. So what he wants to do is say, we'll start off with an initial setup, and the initial setup will always be the least amount of knowledge possible, right? That is, we want the most general conception of justice, and so if we want the most general conception of justice, we need the most disinterested people as possible. But here's the problem, right, is that as we talk about these principles of justice, our original setup, the less we know about that original setup, the more difficult it is to figure out what the judgments we can make about the original setup. And so what he wants to say is that what we have to do is we work it from both ends. We start with the initial setup, we develop judgments, and then from those we derive our principles. But let's say we find that our judgments are too restrictive, then we'll change the initial setup in order to derive. So we sort of work it back and forth ultimately to derive these two principles. This is, I hope that makes some sense, but this is what he's talking about when he talks about reflective equilibrium. Okay? And that's sort of the idea he's after. Now, there are limits to the investigation. And they're important limits. And the first thing is that justice as fairness is not a complete contract theory. So John Rawls does not think that he's doing a type of social contract theory that we see Rousseau doing, for instance. Because a social contract theory could be extended into being a general moral theory, a moral theory in general. That is, social contract theory can be used to identify why certain morals exist as opposed to other morals. Now, that is not our subject, because we're interested in political and social institutions, and we're looking at that particular problem, which means that we're not evaluating, for instance, things like when is lying morally wrong. That is not a question for us, because that is not a question that would occur within a political or social institutional framework. So that means that social contract theory is much bigger than what Rawls is after. Rawls is after justice as fairness and applying this notion to our sort of procedural mechanisms within political theory. So I think we can understand really Rawls as a political philosopher, not necessarily a moral philosopher, though I think there are important consequences. Now, let me stipulate that what are the two principles of justice? So we're just going to jump right to it, because these are the two principles he sets forth. And I encourage you to write these down and memorize them, in fact, because they're really critical. And so once we've assumed the original position, Rawls speculates that we're going to eventually, through this reflective equilibrium, we're going to eventually come to the idea that there's two principles for justice. And in general, the first principle is a positive principle. That is, it's assigning certain freedoms to us, whereas the second principle is a negative principle. So let me read it. The first principle is that each person in our society is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with the similar liberty for others, right? So you can see this is effectively the principle for liberalism par excellence, where the idea is we want as many people as possible to have the most amount of liberties as possible, but these liberties have to be compatible. That means that we can't give one person the right of being a slave owner and another person not having that right, or that is, another person gets to be a slave. So you can see automatically things like slavery are going to be out the window. And that would make sense from the original position, because who, after all, would want to slave in a society? Virtually no one that I can imagine. So that's the first principle. The second principle is not altogether well, it's different, but it's not altogether unrelated. That is, social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both A, reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, and B, attached to positions and offices that are open to all. So you can see here the first one's positive in the sense that we're going to assign and give people rights. But the second one's negative, because Rawls recognizes that because we're talking about human society and human culture, there's always going to be an economic or other inequality. Not everyone is going to get everything. And so that means there are economic inequalities. And so the question concerns how are we supposed to arrange those economic inequalities? And he thinks we should arrange them, one, so that they're generally to everyone's advantage, and that we reasonably expect them to be to everyone's advantage, I should put. Right, we don't think that these social economic inequalities are going to result in disadvantages to everyone. And B, that these advantages, that these social inequalities and be attached to specific positions and offices within an institution that are open to everyone. So that means that we're going to automatically exclude the possibility of an aristocracy, the idea that people are just born into positions of power, because that would be economic inequality and social inequality, and so we're going to automatically disregard those. So now here's a little bit of explanation that I think is probably helpful when we talk about these. there's sort of 3 points that I wanted to make in terms of helping to explain this. The first is that these principles apply to the basic structure of society. We're not talking about every type of social structure, right? We're not talking about the relationship that, for instance, parents have with their children. We're talking about basic structures. So that means social structures can be essentially divided into 2 sets. That should be a T there. By the way, I hate it when I see spelling error while I'm giving this presentation, so my apologies. But these social structures can be divided into 1, secure and equal liberties of citizenship. So the first principle here is talking about political liberties, right? The second here principle is actually talking about those that specify and establish social and economic inequality. So we're talking about here is distribution of income and wealth. So you can see here when we talk about justice, what Rawls is trying to do is he's trying to articulate a principle for just distribution, but then on the other hand talk about just forms of just rights and political powers. So political liberties and distribution. These are the 2 key facets of social life that Rawls is trying to address with these 2 principles. Now, the important thing, though, is that the first principle has logical priority. That means that I first have to satisfy the political liberties. So that means that, for instance, I can't, in order to satisfy the distribution of income and wealth, ignore the political liberties that are established for citizens. So the first one is prior to the second one. That's pretty important, especially if we're going to talk about the establishment of unequal distribution. So number C is that all the social values, liberty and opportunity, income and wealth, and the basis of self-respect are to be distributed equally unless, that should be a U, an unequal distribution of any or all of these values is to everyone's advantage. So you can see here that means that, for instance, the only time when we're going to take away liberty equally is if by doing so we can actually create an advantage for everyone. And so that's the sort of idea here. And I think a sort of way of imagining this is imagine if you were on a ship, right? Talk about citizenship. If you are on a ship, and there's a certain person who is better, who knows how to sail, because I personally am not a sailor, so I don't know how to sail. But if I'm on a ship and I'm with someone who does know how to sail, it would seem that it's actually to everyone's advantage on the ship to let that person have an unequal position in terms of determining how we're going to, get from one island to another, rather than letting everyone equally decide, right? Does that make sense? So when something's to everyone's advantage, we can actually talk about not maintaining equal distributions and equal values, okay? So what does that mean about injustice? What of injustice? Injustice, then, quote, is simply inequalities that are not to the benefit of all, right? So that means that in his view, something is unjust or unjust when there's an inequality that cannot be reasonably defended. Now, but, there's a big but here. Quote, the situation where someone is considering how to allocate certain commodities to needy persons who are known to him is not within the scope of these principles. They are meant to regulate basic institutional arrangements. Now, basically what Rawls is doing on page 64 when he reminds us of that is what he's saying is, remember, this is not a moral theory. So I'm not telling you we can't use these principles to figure out what sorts of needy persons we should give money to first. He's saying, no, we're just talking about how to regulate basic institutional arrangements. We're talking about basic social structure here. So there's definitely a limit in terms of how one wants to apply these principles of justice, and that is the defining feature there. Now, the veil of ignorance. I got to talk a little bit more about this, because the veil of ignorance essentially refers to the epistemic condition of those who are in the original position. Now, epistemic refers to knowledge. It comes from the root word is epistemology, or episteme, which means knowledge in Greek. And the idea here is that people in the original position, there must be a veil of ignorance, so people don't know who they are in this society, right? We have to take away their knowledge. It's an epistemic condition. So that means the veil of ignorance means not knowing how specific deliberative alternatives will affect one's own particular case, and being obliged to evaluate principles solely on the basis of really quite general considerations. So what is known under the veil of ignorance? Well, the first thing to recognize here is that certain kinds of facts are ignored within the veil of ignorance. For instance, we're going to ignore the place we have in our society, our class position, whether we're poor, rich, or middle class, our social status. For instance, whether or not, I won't try to define a social status, but we're going to ignore social status. We're also going to ignore the distribution of goods. We have to ignore how the distribution of goods are distributed to me or to others, to my neighbors, and so forth. And we're also going to ignore our natural assets and abilities. So we're not going to assume that everyone's the same. In fact, we're just going to ignore what our natural capacities and abilities are, with the exception of reason. We're going to maintain that everyone still has reason and is rational. So that's a natural asset and ability that we're not going to ignore. Now, what is known within the veil of ignorance? Well, one knows the basic features of human social life, right? That means you understand the basics of how human beings live together and how they work together. You understand that there's understand the basic political affairs that we would need to talk about. For instance, the idea that there's such a thing as laws, and we could talk about what types of laws. He thinks that we could even know the principles of economic theory. In fact, we really need to know the principles of economic theory. We have to know the basics of social organization and probably the basics of human psychology. And so he thinks that there's a set of things we know and there's a set of things we don't know. Now you can see here, this is how he's going to modify with his reflective equilibrium here in order to derive these principles of justice. So that's it. That gives you a little bit more knowledge about what we mean by talking about the veil of ignorance. There is another thing I should mention here is the basic idea here is that the veil of ignorance takes away any basis we have for bargaining. Because remember, Rawls's goal is deliberation, right? He doesn't want to bargain his way to justice. He wants to deliberate to justice, which means I'm not going to give you something so that you can give me what I want. Rather, the goal here in figuring out what the just society would be to start where we're just starting from the very beginning. So that also applies to future generations. So that means that whatever my temporal position is, right, whether or not I'm John Adams in the Revolutionary War, or I'm Teddy Roosevelt at the end of the 19th century, or I'm Barack Obama in the 21st century, right? That whatever position I am in terms of time, each person is forced to choose for everyone. So that's the sort of guiding idea behind the veil of ignorance. Okay? So what does this leave us with in terms of some concluding thoughts here? Well, it leaves us with the idea here is that I think John Rawls provides us with a series of principles that are suited for social and political institutions. And I think these principles of justice can be a way that we can sort of ask the question how certain social institutions like universities, for instance, how these institutions can be arranged or understood as being just. That is, we can ask this question: do those institutions meet the criteria set forth by the principles of justice established through the original position? And number two here, it means that some form of regulated capitalism, I think, can be defended. So that means that I think that we have this big challenge for Marx. I think that Rawls provides us with some sort of means for addressing that challenge, because Rawls isn't going to support. I think that the principles of justice here are going to deny a laissez-faire economic model. A laissez-faire economic model refers to an economic model where hands-off, no regulation, we let the market be completely free. And Rawls is going to be against that, because Rawls is going to say, well, in a laissez-faire economic model, that model is not going to satisfy our principles of justice. So that means that the institutions that we have in our economic system, for instance, like the stock market, this institution must be a regulated institution. And that means we can use Rawls to support some version of the current system in terms of having a regulated economy. And we can also use these principles of justice to sort of ascertain how and in what areas, for instance, a social institution like the stock market would be unequal and unjust, and how it could be reformed. So I think what we get here is we get on the concluding end here out of Rawls, when we take on the original position and we take on this reflective equilibrium model and the veil of ignorance and so forth, we derive these two principles of justice, which we can then use to defend liberalism. So I think that I'm hoping you can see Rawls here as a way, as a sort of, as a response to all of this stuff we've looked at from Hegel all the way up to Foucault. And we can argue, for instance, that social contractual theory, or at least a certain version of it, can be defended in terms of liberalism, and it can be defended using these principles of justice. So that's what I want to get across with regard to John Rawls. What we're going to look at in our last video here is we're going to look at how Robert Nozick, a philosopher, is going to attack Rawls here and argue against this, and argue for a much more libertarian position. So that's what we have coming up next, but that's our video for this week. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and I really encourage you to take a look at these principles of justice. And I would even encourage you to sort of hypothetically find some friends, get together, and try to assume an original position and see what principles of justice you would come up with, and see whether or not you would come up with the same ones Rawls did. Okay? Thank you guys for watching. I look forward to seeing you guys online. Bye.